So this was the question which we were doing in our previous session. The question says the principal impetus. Let me first explain to you what is the meaning of impetus. Impetus means the driver, the force or the driver. The principal impetus or the driver or the reason for the enactment of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act by the US Congress was. Why the US Congress brought a law, enacted a law. Enact means to bring the law into force. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977. Why this law was brought? What was the force or the driver behind that? Let me tell you the exact reason. That's what we were doing in our previous session. So we were discussing that it is normal for many governments across the world to wiretape the telephone calls. The call I make, the calls you make to your friends and to your families, those calls are recorded. So at that time, the President Richard Nixon, he authorized the wiretaping of fellow politicians instead of the citizens. So when the recordings were made, it was discovered that many US companies were in practice of paying out bribes, bribes, rishwa, bribes to government officials, bribes to politicians, and bribe to political parties in foreign countries. So there were many evidences that the companies were paying bribes internationally, not only to just business executives, but to, look at these, to the officials in West Germany, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, and in Saudi Arabia. Lockheed Martin is one of the most advanced and most, I would say, powerful company in arms manufacturing. They manufacture fighter jets. They manufacture passenger jets. They manufacture very deadly arms, drones, missiles, so on and so forth. So these companies, Lockheed Martin and so on, so these companies used to pay rishwa to the government officials in these countries so as to obtain orders. So so what you're looking for is why the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was introduced. This is the reason. So Security Exchange Commission in the US started investigation, and they identified there were 400 companies in the US who were paying out rishwa. So immediately after that, they passed a law, enacted a law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act 1977, and this law was a response of these discoveries. That was the reason, the force behind this law. Now let's go to the question. So now we know the principal impetus or the driver for the enactment of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act by the US Congress was to discourage unethical behavior by foreigners employed by the US firm. There is no such thing, unethical behavior. It was all about rishwa. So A is not right. Let's cross this out. A is not right. Okay. B. Promote the mandates. Mandates means authority issued by the United Nations. There is no mention of United Nations. This is totally wrong. No United Nations are involved. Then prevent the bribery, yes, rishwa, of foreign officials by the US firms seeking to do business overseas. This is the exact reason why the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was introduced, and that's why it's rightly marked as green, and which is the right option. Let's move on. This is a good question here. A US publicly traded company, a US company that is listed on the US Stock Exchange, completed its annual audit and internal control assessment. An external auditor attested to the financial statement. External auditor came, he audited the financial statements by giving an audit opinion. He gave the audit opinion, but he did not report on the management's assessment of the internal controls. He audited the financial statements, but he did not audit or did not give his opinion on the management's assessment of the system of internal control. Did the company violate the section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act? Sarbanes-Oxley Act It's a huge, huge piece of legislature, huge piece of statute. There's more than 600 sections. Interestingly, your CMA Part 1 requires you to know about only 6 sections, not 600, just 6. Section 201, Section 202, 203, Section 204, Section 302, Section 404 and Section 407. You have to know these numbers exactly as they are, because there are many questions on the essay type and they ask you to tell what the Section 2A is all about. What is the Section 204 is all about in your own words. You don't need to memorize the exact wording of these sections. It's just that you have to know what these sections are. What is Section 404 is all about, just generally. What is Section 407 is all about. So these are just 6 sections of Sarbanes-Oxley Act, SOX 2001 in your syllabus, and don't go beyond that. And remember, you need to memorize these section numbers and you need to know what is in these sections briefly. Do not memorize. Let me show you. I think I already have got these are the sections in sequence. So the Section 201, just a brief overview. I'm not going to go into detail because you would be doing it yourself. So Section 201, this section prohibits that the audit firm will only perform audit and it will not do any bookkeeping. It will not do any financial information system design and implementation. It will not do any appraisal or valuation. It will not do actuarial services, internal audit services, management functions, broker or dealer, investment advisor, legal services. These are all prohibited. An audit firm will not perform these services. And what an audit firm can do with audit, it can only do tax works. Only tax consultation is allowed. Let's say if I'm the auditor of your company, I can only do the audit and tax work. I cannot do these things for your company. It's illegal under Section 201. This is what you have to remember. Maybe just 2 or 3 so that you can write in your answer in the return response of the essay section. No need to memorize every number, every item here, just few. And then you need to know that 201 is about that the audit firm will not perform any of these services, only audit and tax consult. This is Section 201. Then Section 203, it requires that the audit partners must be rotated, like CPA firms must rotate their audit. Let's say your firm is KPMG and you audit Saudi Aramco, for example, which is one of the largest companies in the world. KPMG can continue auditing Saudi Aramco maybe for 50 years, no problem. But what KPMG should do, it should rotate their lead auditors after every 5 years. So it says that it shall be unlawful for a registered public accounting firm to provide audit services to an issuer for more than 5 fiscal years of that issuer. So the audit firms must rotate. Audit firm not to be rotated. KPMG can continue to audit Saudi Aramco for 100 years. What they should do, they should rotate their audit partners. Maybe the firm has 5 audit partners, A, B, C, D, and E. First 5 years with A, next 5 years with B, next 5 years with C, then D, and then A, and then E. So you keep on rotating the audit partner. This is Section 203. You need to know that. You can just write in your own words. Then you have Section 204. I'm just going to give you the brief. Section 204 says that if the auditor finds anything wrong in the financial statements and there is a disagreement between management, let's say this is the auditor and it doesn't agree to a certain accounting treatment and management is resisting. There's a fight between auditor and the management. Auditor, instead of fighting with the management, auditor should take this issue to the audit committee. If you are a CPA and if there is a disagreement between you and the management, take the issue to the audit committee. Just keep that in mind. This is Section 204, right? Then we have a huge section, quite long. It's Section 302. This section says that the management is responsible for the internal controls. Management will sign the financial statements. Management will review, not only sign, the management will also review the report, and then the financial statement will be submitted, and management must certify that the financial statements are fair, they do not miss anything, there is no untrue statement, and there is no omission of any material fact. And it's quite long. Management must certify this. You just need to go through it. Do not memorize this. No memorization is required. Just you need to have an understanding what it is all about, so that you can write in your own words and you can understand what the text is all about. So then we have section 404. This is the one we are interested in. This section requires the management to assess the system of internal controls. External auditor will come, a CPA will come. That CPA will do two things. He will audit the financial statements. This is the first task he should perform. And the second, he should also audit the management's assessment of internal control. He should write two reports. What we see in this question, that auditor, let me show you here. Auditor came, an external auditor attested the financial statements by giving an audit opinion, but did not report on the management's assessment of the internal controls. This is he didn't do. He should do that under section 404. Let me show you. So under section 404, see, this is what is required to do. This is the relevant part here. This is the relevant part. I've just copied the entire section, but you just need to know the basic thing. Section 404 requires that the auditor should do two things. He should give two audit opinions. One on the internal controls and one on the financial statements. So in our question, the auditor has given opinion on the financial statements, but he has given no opinion on the internal control. So two audit opinions are required. So that's what is missing in this question. See, so did the company violate section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act? No, the company was still in compliance due to the safe harbor rules. There is no such thing safe. We just need to know those 6 sections I've told you. And there are no such things, safe harbor rules or anything like that in our syllabus. Yes, because the company did not include a certification from the CFO and CEO. There is no such mentioning whether or not CFO, CEO give any certification. The question is silent. What we see here that the auditor should do 2 audits, 2 opinions are required, one on financial statement and other on internal control. So this is not correct. C. No, but the company has violated section 302 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. There is no indication that the company CFO and CEO did not certify the financial statements. Section 302 requires that the Chief Financial Officer or Chief Accounting Officer and the CEO, they must review the financial statements, then they must certify. But we don't have any information here, so we can't say. Yes, this is true. D. Yes, because the company did not have an auditor attest to and report on the assessment of internal controls. Auditors should do 2 types of audits, 2 opinions, one on the financial statement, other on internal control. This is what was missing. That's why the company is in violation of section 404. Now let me just do the other sections also, so you have the understanding. Section 404, then section 407. This section is very simple. This is the last section. As I said, there are just 6 sections in CMA Part 1 on Sarbanes-Oxley Act 2002. Section 4 says that at least one person in the audit committee must be a financial expert. Just this, you need to remember this. SEC requires that the company, the listed company, should have at least one member of the audit committee who is a financial expert. And when you say the financial expert, means he knows accounting, he knows accounting standards, and he probably is a CPA. If he is not CPA, but he should be the one who knows accounting, he knows finance. So that is required in section 407. Okay, going back to our sequence of questions here. So that now we know that D is the right answer. Moving on. I think this is just the repetition, section 404. Then we have this one, yes. Keys Company, a manufacturer of keyboards, incorporates non-financial information into its analysis. Non-financial information other than dollars and decision-making process. So they bring in non-financial information other than the financial information. Key is practicing what? Integrated thinking, shareholder wealth growth, global citizenship, compliance with the international standards. There is no indication regarding international standards. International standards, IFRS, they are on on the financial reporting side, not on the non-financial information. So this is clearly not D, global citizenship concept. There is no such concept in as far as CMA Part 1 is concerned. It is clearly integrated thinking, that the company not only provides the balance sheet, income statement, cash flow statement, the company also provides the non-financial information. Let me show you what is integrated thinking. I hope I have the video slide open for you. This is the one. This is what you call the integrated thinking. Integrated thinking is based on the principle of connectivity and interdependence. Now, what does it mean? It means your financial statements, they are incomplete unless we are also provided with certain non-financial information. Because financial and non-financial information, they give us the big picture. They give us an integrated approach. And this is what you call the integrated thinking, right? The principle of connectivity and interdependence. A business is operating not in jungle, not in a desert. A business is operating in a society. A business is connected to other elements within the society. There are many participants, many stakeholders, and they're all interconnected. So a business is connected to different stakeholders, to society, to the environment. There is connectivity, there is interdependence, and this concept is called integrated thinking. And that was what the question was all about, that it involves integrated thinking. This is the area that was added a couple of years ago, what you call that integrated reporting. Okay, then we have, okay, this is a good one. Value creation in the context of integrated reporting. Let me show you what is value creation. This one, let's take on the bigger picture. Value creation process. This is the value creation process. Let me explain the idea. I am sure you would have gone through the topic, integrated reporting. There are 6 capitals: financial capital, money; manufactured capital; intellectual capital; human capital; social, relationship, and natural. These are 6 capitals which are business inputs. Then through business activities, the business creates outputs, and these outputs will result in some outcomes. Resultant outcome would be that the financial capital will grow. What does it mean? Let's say if you started with $10,000 a year ago, and if you have successful in the running the business, your financial capital will grow to $12,000. In most of the cases, there could be loss also, but mostly when the business is run efficiently, your financial capital grows, right? And you can compare that here the color is light blue, but here it's dark blue. Here the color is light pink. After when the input is processed into output, outcome would result in more manufactured capital, more intellectual capital, more human capital, more social relationships, and more natural capital as a result. This is what you call the value creation process. That a business takes in 6 capitals through inputs and business activities, it creates output, and these outputs will result into some consequences, which in many cases would increase these capitals: financial, manufactured, intellectual. So I have a separate lecture on these areas on integrated reporting, so I can share with you the YouTube link if you want to go through it in detail, right? So that would give you I have everything recorded, every single topic. Name any topic you want. I can share the video of that lecture in our WhatsApp group. If you have any confusions of what is, or let's say let's just talk about these. What are these 6 Sarbanes-Oxley Act 2002 sections? I want to know. I can share that lecture with you. Every single topic of CMA Part 1 and Part 2 is there. You just need to name it, sir, I need this, and I will share it in your group. We have spent a lot of time in CMA. We have everything you need. Okay, integrated thinking is done. Then I think this one is the same question. This is the same question with the correct option C, and here we have the correct option, that is C as well. Then this is little unreadable, but what I can tell you is that it's about transfer pricing. We also have a lecture on this. Every single topic, yes, Siddiq, every single topic you need in CMA, I have it with me. So you don't have to be worried about any topic. Just you need to tell me, sir, I need this topic video. I can share it on our WhatsApp group without any hesitation. It's there. Okay, in responsibility accounting, there are 4 types of responsibility centers: cost, revenue, profit and investment center. This is studied in section C, performance management. Then out of these 2 responsibility centers, the profit center and investment center, they are affected by what you call the transfer pricing. Transfer pricing involves the price that one of the segments charges to another segment in the same organization. Let's say, talk about Saudi Aramco, which is, I keep on referring to this firm. It's one of the largest companies in the world. Let's say it has segment A, B, C, and they keep on buying and selling from each other. So at what price they should sell to each other, that price is called transfer pricing. So there are many transfer pricing. There is a separate topic: negotiated pricing, there is market-based pricing, variable pricing, markup-based pricing, full cost pricing, absorption cost pricing. So many. So if you ask me which of these is the best transfer pricing, there is no doubt market-based transfer pricing. Let me show you. So this is it. This is transfer pricing, the price that is charged by one segment of the organization for the goods and services it provides to another segment in the same organization. So within the same firm, what the price will charge by one to another. So there are many types of transfer pricing techniques. We can use this market-based, see, differential outlay, full absorption cost, variable costing, cost plus negotiation. If you ask me, sir, which of these is the best? And if I tell you what is the best, this is the best. Market price theoretically is the best method, pricing method, right? It would be given. This is the best method. Market price is the best transfer price to use in many situations, right? But there are other methods which are suitable in different situations. But market price is considered to be the best. So this was the question on market price, on the transfer pricing. So unfortunately, I just given you the idea, but it's not readable. So I'm just going to move on to the next area. This question we have done yesterday. It's already in the video. So we have been given different items of income statement and balance sheet. We are required to find out the total current assets. So if you remember, we added up cash, account receivables and inventories, and we got 35,000. That's in our yesterday's video, right? So there's no need to redo this question. And gentlemen, here we go. Here now we have inventory, and here we come for which we have started these sessions. Let me take you back to what we are doing. Here we go. These were the 5 specific areas that you people have identified. Now we are on LIFO and FIFO. What is LIFO? What is FIFO? So that now we can proceed with the questions that are coming. So now let us discuss LIFO, perpetual, periodic, FIFO, perpetual and periodic in a separate slide that is from my section A, CMA part 1. And we go directly to the relevant part, and here we go. This is one. Okay, inventory cost flow assumptions. The choice of inventory costing method is not based on the physical flow of goods on the shelves. We have 4 methods, by the way, but we will be discussing FIFO and LIFO. That's what you have pointed out. So let us discuss the first in first out and the last in first out, and then see how we can do the computations, what basically FIFO, LIFO means. So let's do it. Let's first do the first in first out. This is the graphical, what you can say, this is the representation of first in first out. First in first out means that the oldest costs, let's say I purchased an item 6 months ago at $10. Then the price went up, I bought the same item for $18, then $19. So when we follow first in first out, the oldest costs, they. So let's do some computations that will help us understand. First in, first out means the oldest costs, they are kicked out first. Oldest cost, they go to CGS, and the latest cost, they go to ending inventory. Now this is the pictorial representation. How does it actually work in numbers? Let's do that. Now we have beginning inventory of 1000 units, and this was purchased at 5.25, value is 5250, just multiplication. Then we purchased item on 3rd, 20th, 15th and 29th at these prices, and these were their total value. Remember, we are using first in, first out, FIFO. Now what happened? For the whole year, we had a total of 2250 units available with a total valuation of 12,210. We need to see under the FIFO method what is the value of ending inventory under FIFO and what is the CGS. Let's go back. We have just learned that under FIFO, the oldest cost, the oldest buyings, they go to CGS, and the latest purchase, it goes to ending inventory. That's what you call FIFO. Okay. If this is true, then your CGS must be on those costs which are oldest. So if you have sold 1050 units, then those 1050 units must be from the oldest purchase, oldest cost. So I'm going to write 1000 units at the rate of 5.25, and remaining 50 will of course come from here, 50 at the rate of 5.30. See, this is called the first in, first out. The oldest item, they are kicked out first. If I just do the total computations here, it will be 1000 multiplied by 5.25 plus 50 multiplied by 5.30. That gives me 5515. 5515. This is the CGS under the FIFO method. Then how do I find the ending inventory? It's very simple. Ending inventory simply out of these 500, 50 has come here, remaining 450 units, and they will be priced at the rate of 5.3 each, so they will be valued at 450 multiplied by 5.3 is going to be 2385. So 2385 plus 1680 plus 1450 plus 118 give me the ending value. So I'm going to just simply add 1680 plus 1450, 1180, right? So this gives me 6695. So what I have done, under first in, first out, the oldest cost, they have been charged to CGS, and the latest cost, they become the part of your ending inventory. You can do this working here. These 450 units at the rate of 5.3, then 300 units at the rate of 5.60, then 250 units at the rate of 5.80 if I can see clearly, and then lastly these 200 units at the rate of 5.9. So if you add up all these, you'll get 6695. So we have the same numbers, 6695 and 5515 for our ending inventory and the CGS. This is given right here, see in the next slide. 6695 for ending inventory and 5515 for CGS. This method is called the first in, first out, right? Now, let's do a question so as to understand. This question is from Gleim. You will see this in the Gleim software. An entity started in year 1 with 200 scented candles. This is the beginning stock or opening inventory at a cost of 3.5. Okay. These candles sell for $7 each. Okay. The following schedule represents purchases and sales of candles during year 1. All the details is given. Now what we need to find out if the entity uses periodic FIFO, find the gross profit for the year. In order to find gross profit, you need sales, you need cost of sales, also called the cost of goods sold, and you can simply find your gross profit, right? Since we have to use FIFO first in, first out, how many units did you sell? Look at this. We sold 150, 100, 200 and 300. If I add all these, 150 plus 100 plus 200 plus 300, I've sold a total of 750 units. and these 750 units have been sold at the rate of 7 each. So my sales revenue is 750 multiplied by 7. It's 5250. Right? Since we are using FIFO, FIFO means first in, first out. So these 750 units, they should be valued at the oldest prices. Let's do that. Let's do that. I would like to calculate the cost of these 750 units. Out of these 750 units, 200 units were priced at the rate of 3.5. Then remaining 250, they were priced at the rate of 3.3. I need to get up to the total of 750. Then the 200 number, it was priced at the rate of 3.10. Oldest cost first. And how many now? 200 plus 2, 650. I need 100 more, and these 100s will come from here. 100 at the rate of 3. If you just add all these, this will give you the cost of sales, right? Oldest costs have been charged first. So 200 multiplied by 3.5 plus 250 multiplied by 3.3 plus 200 multiplied by 3.1 and plus 100 multiplied by 3. This gives me a total of 2445. This is your CGS, cost of goods sold. So the difference between sales and CGS is what you call the gross profit. So my gross profit is going to be 2805. 2805, that makes B to be the correct option, and 2805 B it is. Right? So this method I've done, this is called the periodic method. What is the difference between periodic and perpetual? Let me take you back to this. Periodic and perpetual, you need to know the difference. I hope it's somewhere in the previous area. This is comparison between perpetual and periodic. This is the difference between periodic and perpetual. In perpetual system, whenever you purchase, the records are updated. The meaning of perpetual is, the literal meaning of perpetual is forever. That's the literal meaning, forever. That will last, less like God is forever. Allah is forever. That's the idea. Perpetual means forever. But in accounting, the perpetual means the system that is always updated. A system that is always updated. Right? So a perpetual system is a system that provides up-to-date inventory records. Whenever we purchase something, it will update our inventory. Whenever we sell something, immediately our records are updated. So perpetual means our systems are always updated, our inventory numbers are always updated. That's called perpetual. But when you say periodic, in the periodic system, what we do, we just keep on purchasing items. Let me just give you it in a simple way. In periodic methods, we keep on purchasing the items in all the year, and we keep on recording the sales all the year. At the end of the year, we see how much we bought, how much we sold, and what is the value of the closing stock. So the value of closing stock is only determined at the end of the period. At the end of the period. That's why it's called periodic. At the end of the period, we only come to know what is the value of our stock. That's why it's called periodic. Whereas in perpetual, as the name suggests, that the inventory records are always up to date. Every purchase, every sale will update your inventory numbers. Right? So that is the difference. Now the question, $1 million question. What we have done so far, we have done periodic. What we have done now, the question we have done, that was periodic. Inventory cost flow. This is what we are doing. This is periodic. See, what I did, I simply added all my purchases and all my sales, and then I calculated the number at the end of the period. This is, gentlemen, periodic. And this is where you people will be tested, periodic. You will be tested on exam on periodic. Why not perpetual? The reason is that perpetual valuation is complex. It takes a lot of time. Like in this question, I think I hardly done this question in 3 minutes, right? But if the same question was required to be done under perpetual method, you will have to match every transaction by transaction. You know what you will do? Okay, 200 items bought and 150 sold. How many balance remain? This much. Okay, then we bought 250 more at this price and 100 sold. Okay, what is the balance? this and these many this. So every transaction must be identified individually, separately. If this question is done using perpetual, it will take at least 10 to 15 minutes. 10 to 15 minutes. Every transaction of purchase and sale is matched one by one. And that is the reason you will not be tested. It is in your syllabus, but you will not be tested on perpetual because that is time consuming, right? That is time consuming. Most of the questions have been examined based on periodic, and all the questions on GLIME are periodic. Perpetual are time consuming. Okay, now we have another question here. Illustrated below is perpetual inventory card. This is similarly like perpetual inventory card that shows you when you bought, when you sold, bought, sold, bought, sold. This is perpetual inventory card. But what we did here, this was not perpetual. It simply showed you what did you purchase and what did you sell in single. It didn't give you the sale and purchase date wise. This is a periodic card. This is the periodic information of your inventory. This is the perpetual, where we have a clear distinction between when did you what, when. But we solved it using periodic way because I simply added what we sold and I simply saw what we had and then we accordingly calculated this. So this is what you call the perpetual inventory, where every sale and purchase is given separately date wise. But we don't have to use perpetual method here. What does it say in the question? Illustrated below is a perpetual inventory card for the current year. The ending inventory balance under the first in first out method inventory valuation. First in first out. I'm not going to see which item did I buy first because I'm going to use the periodic method. Under the periodic method, I simply total all my purchases. 1,000, 2,500 is my purchase, and sale is 5 plus 3, 800. Simple. I didn't bother what was the date, or I simply got 2,500 is my purchase and 800 is my sale, which means my closing stock should be 2,500 less 800. So my closing stock should be 1,700, right? That's my closing stock value. Now, since it is first in first out, all the oldest items would have been sold. I have remaining 1,700 closing stock. This 1,700 closing stock should be from my latest purchases. Why? Because this is the reason, gentlemen. The reason is under FIFO, your recent cost, the items which we purchased recently, they are considered as the ending inventory. So we are going to apply the same concept here. Under the FIFO method, these 1,700 units in the closing stock, they must be from our latest purchases. So out of these 1,700, 1,000 units were purchased at 1.65 and remaining 700 still needs to be broken down into 500 and then 200. So 1,000 units at 1.65, 500 units at the rate of 2.2, and then the remaining 200 in order to give you a total of 1,700 at the rate of 2. So if you add up all these, 1650 plus 500 multiplied by 2.2 plus 200 multiplied by 2, it gives me 3150. 3150. This is the value of FIFO inventory using FIFO valuation at the end of the period. So that is clearly option B, and as you can see, B is the right answer. Okay, now, as I said, we have a system perpetual where every transaction and every purchase and sale is matched, other is periodic. And we have FIFO method, we have LIFO method, we have weighted cost method, which is called average cost method, AVCO, and then we also have specific identification, but that doesn't fall here. Remember, whether you use perpetual or periodic, FIFO method will give you the same answer whether you use perpetual or periodic. This is interesting. You just need to remember, you don't have to calculate. FIFO gives you the same answer under perpetual or periodic. But LIFO perpetual is different and LIFO periodic is different. Average cost method under perpetual, it's different, and average cost under periodic, it is different. That's just the comparison I want to make, that FIFO is the same in perpetual and periodic. LIFO and AVCO, they are not. What's the difference? Remember, in periodic, we simply sum up all the purchase and all the sales and then simply go in a single go. But in perpetual, we go line by line. Sale, purchase, sale, purchase, sale. Every item is done separately, and then we come to know what is the value of inventory. That's clearly a very long computation, so that's not tested on your exam. Questions will be on periodic method. So the question here says, the inventory method yielding the same inventory measurement and cost of goods sold, whether perpetual and periodic, that is your first in first out. That gives you B to be the correct option. Otherwise, the remaining, they will give the different answers. Now we come on to the last in first out. Under the last in first out, as you can see, last in first out. Under the last in first out, the latest recent cost, they are charged to cost of goods sold, and your oldest cost, they go to ending inventory. This method is totally opposite to the previous method. In the previous method, oldest cost was charged to CGS, recent cost was included in inventory, but here the recent cost go to CGS and the oldest cost, they go to the ending inventory, right? Now let's do the same question, but this time we are going to do the last in first out. And please, gentlemen, remember, last in first out method is only allowed under the US GAAP, and it is also used in China. Last in first out method is not allowed under IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standard. They do not permit last in first out. This method is only applicable in the US GAAP, in the US, and of course it is used in China. So what is it? Let's do it. And again, we are going to do it in the periodic method. And what is periodic? In periodic method, we simply add up all our purchase, we add up all our sale, and we go in a single go and find the numbers. That's called periodic. But in perpetual, it's a long, painful exercise, and that is carefully avoided. You don't see any question of perpetual computations on your exam. All right. So since we are talking about last in first out, what we are going to do, we are going to do the same thing which we did previously, but this time we have to make sure that your latest costs, these latest costs, they are charged to CGS. These are your latest costs. These are the costs that will be charged to your cost of goods sold. And your oldest costs, they go to your ending inventory. So let us do this, the similar workings, but this time in the opposite direction. Let's do it. All right. I have my pointer. Okay. Since I'm using last and first out, so these 1050, they must be from my latest purchases. So 1050 should go from 200 units in the reverse order. 200 units at the rate of 5.9, then 250 units at the rate of last in first out. Remember, the latest purchase is charged to CGS. 250 at the rate of 5.80, then 300 at the rate of 5.60. What is the total now? I have to go up to 1050. So I have 200 plus 250 plus 300. I've got 570. So I need how many more? I just need 1050. I just need 480 units from here. 1050 less 200, less 250, less 300. I just need 300 units from here. So 200 units at the rate of 5.9, 250 at the rate of 5.80, 300 at the rate of 5.60, and out of these 5.3, I just need 300 units only at the rate of 5.3. So gentlemen, what I'm going to do, 300 units out of these remaining 200 at the rate of 5.3, they will go to the ending inventory. The rest of them I'm just calculating. So I'm going to do the computation. 300 into 5.3, and I can just simply add the rest of the numbers, 1680, 1450 and 1180. This gives me 5900. This is the cost of sales. Last in, first out. The latest costs have been charged to your CGS, and your oldest costs 5.25 and these 200 at the rate of 5.3. So your closing stock given in the red color will have 1000 units at the oldest cost 5.25, and 200 units at the rate of 5.3. If you do the computation, it's going to be 5250 plus 200 times 5.3 is going to be 6310. 6310. So 6310 is the ending inventory under LIFO and 5900 the cost of goods sold under LIFO. So let's see the numbers, actual numbers. See, they are the same. 6310 for ending inventory and 5900 for the cost of goods sold. So remember, last in first out involves the latest costs charged to CGS and the oldest cost they go to the ending inventory. So let's do a couple of questions to enhance our understanding so we can move along. In periods of rising costs, I need to take the pointer. When the prices are rising, in the period of rising cost, which of the following inventory cost flow assumption will result in the higher cost of sales? So when the prices are rising, we have two methods. Let's discuss. One, we have the first in, first out. Other, we have the last in, first out. If the prices are rising and we are using first in, first out, what it will mean? It will mean that we are charging older, lower costs to CGS, and the current latest costs, higher price, they go to the inventory. But under last in, first out, things are opposite. Under last in, first out, the higher price items, they go to CGS, and the older, lower cost items, they go to inventory. Now come back to the question. In the periods of rising cost, which of the following inventory cost flow assumption will result in higher cost of sales? This is it. Under LIFO method, when the prices are rising, higher prices will go into CGS, so the cost of goods sold will be higher if you use last in, first out, and that's why B is the right answer. Right? So this is the idea of last in, first and first in, first out. I have a complete lecture on this in video. If still something is remaining, I can share the video with you in the WhatsApp, so you can watch that one in detail, so you will know what it's all about. So going back to what we were doing, inventory. Now, this was the question. If I move sequentially, already done. Okay, here we go. A company has inventory with fair value of 35. Okay, this is something that needs to be touched right here, what we are doing. Under US GAAP, inventory reversal is not allowed. I hope I have given it here somewhere. Have I? Maybe somewhere in the slide down the... Okay, if it's not there, let me explain it right here. Maybe somewhere in some other topic. We have two systems parallel. One is the US GAAP and other is the IFRS. Under US GAAP, if you have written down your inventory and if the prices go up, you cannot do the reversal. But under IFRS, if you have written down your inventory, you have wrote your inventory down, but subsequently if the prices go up, you can raise your prices back to the original value. So US GAAP does not allow inventory write down reversal, but under IFRS reversal is allowed. That's the idea. Now let's do this question so you understand the concept well. A company has inventory with a fair value of 35,000 at the beginning of the year. Then in the middle of the year, inventory has dropped down to 15,000. Right? Then the inventory has risen up into 105. What is the inventory value at the end of the year? Now let me show it under both systems. Under the US GAAP, if inventory was written down from 35 to 15,000, right, if it was written down, you cannot reverse. You will have to show it at 15,000. Right? But under the IFRS, if the inventory was written down from 35 to 15 and subsequently the prices went up to 105,000, you cannot take it up to 105. No, you can only bring it back to 35,000. reversal can only be made up to the previous amount. You cannot go above 35. Remember, under US GAAP, if an inventory value 35,000 brought down to 15, you cannot make any reversal under the US GAAP. Reversal is not allowed. But under IFRS, if the inventory was written down from 35 to 15, and if the price went up, you can reverse the write down only up to 35, not beyond that. Maybe the value could go up to $200,000, but the value can only be taken back to 35,000, not above 35,000. So this idea has been explained in this question, so you will make better understanding. Let's do it. It says the question is not fully, I think maybe some part might be here. Yes, this is the one. Question 68. No. Carrying amount is 500,000 this year. However, government authorities unexpectedly announced that the competitor's product has defective and product was removed from the market. As a result, the company's products were again in demand and the company estimated their net realizable value was 750. Okay, now I think whatever I can get from this question, that originally there was some original value of the inventory, not shown here in the slide, just some part of it is there. Now the written write-down value was $500,000. Subsequently, the price went up to $750,000. Inventory was written down from some number to $500,000, but subsequently the price of inventory went up to $750,000. Now, how do we treat it under the US GAAP and how do we treat under IFRS? I've just told you, under US GAAP, reversal is not allowed, no reversal. So under IFRS, $500,000 can be reversed to the original value what it was. It is not shown here, maybe the question is cut. But under the US GAAP, write-up is $0 write-up of the inventory. Under US GAAP, reversal of the inventory write-up is not allowed. If inventory has been written down, no reversal. But under IFRS, you can reverse only up to the previous amount, not beyond that. So I have a complete lecture on this. If still something is missing, you can ask and I can share it in the group. So that was an important point to be noted about inventory. Now what do we have here next? This is what you've done. Okay. Then you've written why the banker uses the cash flow statement. The banker uses the cash flow statement so that he can assess the probable cash flows from operating, financing and investing activities in the future, especially operating cash flows, and the strength of operating cash flows will give the banker some idea whether will you be able to return the money borrowed or not. So to determine the economic feasibility of the company, that should we give the loan to the company, can the company pay us back? So this is the reason why we give. Which of the following is a type of the off-balance sheet financing? There are 4 types of off-balance sheet financing, and I have discussed it in my unit 1. Let me show you all so you know what are the different sorts of types of off-balance sheet financing. In 2021 unit 1, off-balance sheet financing. Will be given just after the topic balance sheet. Okay, these are different types of off-balance sheet financing. This was basically a part 2 topic, but it has been now moved to part 1. Off-balance sheet financing takes 4 principal forms. Investment in unconsolidated subsidiaries. You hold investment in a company above 50%, but you did not consolidate that company. So this is one of the off-balance sheet financing. Special purpose entities. I have a separate lecture on this. If you need, I can send it to you. This is the second type of off-balance sheet financing. Operating leases is the third type of off-balance, and sale of receivables called the factoring. Sale of receivable is also one of the off-balance sheet financing. So this would answer your question here. Which of the following is the type of the off-balance sheet financing? Factoring of account receivables, which is selling of your receivables. How is it an off-balance sheet financing? Maybe, let's say, I've sold my account receivable to you for $150,000, right? I know that some of these customers are bad, really bad, maafi quiz. So these customers may not pay, right? So technically speaking, when these customers do not pay, you will come back to me, sir, you have sold me these customers, these 30,000 customers are not paying. So basically I am liable to pay this 30,000 to you. So affecting of account receivables with recourse, in case if any customer goes bad, you can come back to me. This is called affecting of account receivable with recourse. I am liable to report this 30,000 liability on my balance sheet. If I just give these account receivable to you and I do not recognize this liability of a probable bad debts, this is called off balance sheet financing. This is cheating, right? So that's the idea. Then define other comprehensive income. We know other comprehensive income that we discussed yesterday, that your comprehensive income has two parts. One is called income statement, which you also call the profit and loss account, and other is called the other comprehensive income, right? And collectively it's called statement of comprehensive income. Now, some items is excluded from the calculation of net income and included in the calculation of other comprehensive income. What are they? Let me show you. We discussed that in our yesterday's class, but just quick overview so you know what we're talking about. Go to slide number, just by guess statement, it must be this is it. These are the four specific transactions we discussed. These are the items which are excluded from income statement, but they are included in other comprehensive income. Loss from benefits of post-retirement, not in your syllabus, not in your syllabus in part 1. This is an only item included in your part 1 syllabus. And effective portion of cash flow, this is again in CMA part 2, right? So these are the four items which we discussed. They are part of your other comprehensive income. So these are the items. Then the cash dividends under equity method. What is the effect of the investor's account? Investment account basically should be not the investor account. It is called the investment account. Investment account. Remember, let's say if I purchased 30% shares in a company called X Incorporated, right? And let's say if this company pays me dividend of, just take an example, $70,000. When this dividend is received, how do we affect the investment account? We debit cash because it comes in your bank or in the form of cash, and we credit the investment account. Remember, whenever we receive dividend from our equity-based investee, any dividend received, it is credited to the investment account. There is a separate topic on this called the equity method. If you need that video, you can ask me and I can share it in the group. That will help you understand the idea. Right, so moving on. What do we have next? IT will lower the investment. Which of the following is not type of financing activities? Interest paid to the banker. We borrow money from the banker, the loan. Any interest we pay to the banker, it is considered as an operating activity, right? Interest payment is considered as an operating. Even you receive, let's say I have deposited money in a bank, $100,000 has been invested in a bank, and they pay me interest at the 6%. This interest income, it is also considered as a cash flow from operating activities. Similarly, if I have borrowed 150,000 from a bank and I pay interest at the rate of 8%, this is interest payment. Still it will be considered as a part of cash flow from operating. So remember, gentlemen, interest paid or interest received, they are both considered as cash flow from operating activities. One fine difference you need to remember: interest paid or received, they are both cash flow from operating activities. Now, one important point to be learned here, that if you have made investment in a company and you receive dividend, which you call dividend income, dividend income is reported as a cash flow from operating activities. dividend received. Let me write it in green color. Dividend received. Dividend received is reported as a cash flow from operating activities. But if you declare or pay dividend, dividend paid to our shareholders, whether the preferred stock dividend or the ordinary or common stock dividend, remember gentlemen, under the US GAAP, Americana Haza, under American accounting standards, dividend paid are reported as cash flow from financing activities. That's the difference. Interest paid or received is operating cash inflow outflow, but dividend paid is a cash flow from financing outflow, and dividend received is cash flow from operations. These are the small points you need to remember. Then it says that stock dividend 10%, the market value is higher than par value. What is the effect of the additional paid in capital? This is a good point, and I think it has been explained in the Glimes textbook also. Stock dividend 10% and the market value is higher than the par value. What is the effect? Let me take you back to the specific example that will explain this idea. Okay, now this example will explain the idea. On May 1st, a company's board of directors declared and paid 10% stock dividend on 45,000 shares of common stock outstanding. The par value of the share is $1 and the stock was trading at 15 per share. So the par value is $1, but the stock is trading at $15, which means $14 extra additional paid in capital. Now, since we are issuing 10% stock dividend, so 45,000's 10% will be 4,500. Right? These shares are being issued to the shareholders as stock dividend. How we will record this in our books? We will credit our common stock with $1 because each stock has $1 par. 4,500 into 1, 4,500. This is credited to the common stock. This $14 extra, more than par, the market price is 15, the par is 1, so the extra amount $14. How many shares are we issuing? 4,500. And each share has an extra market premium of $14. So 4,500 multiplied by 14, the number would come 63,000. This 63,000 will be credited to additional paid in capital. Sometimes in India, Pakistan, in your region, it is called share premium. So we will credit the share premium. So 4,500 will be credited to the common stock. 63,000 will be credited to the additional paid in capital, and the total amount of these two will be debited to retained earnings. So this is the idea. If the market price is more than the par, so the extra amount is credited to the additional paid in capital. Let us attach to this another aspect. If your stock dividend is more than 25%, remember the threshold given in the US GAAP is that if your dividends are between 20 to 25%, and if the stock dividend is less than this, this is the treatment taken. You take the market price and you consider the extra amount in the additional paid in capital. Please keep it in mind. Then, if your stock dividend is above 25%, in this case 40%, in that case there is no market price consideration. Like in this example, if the company issues 40% stock dividend, also called the stock split in the form of dividend, we simply debit the retained earning and credit the common stock with par. If you take 40% of 45,000, that will give you $18,000. Simply debit $18,000 in the retained earning, credit 18,000 in common stock. Mafi additional capital here. Remember, when the stock dividend is less than 20 to 25%, then the market price is considered. But when the stock dividend is above 25%, which is 40%, in that case, you simply take the par value and there is no additional paid in capital. There is a detailed lecture on this as well, stock dividends and cash dividends, and you may ask that and I will share it in our group. Everything is there, gentlemen. Every single topic on the face of this planet on CMA part 1 and 2 is there pre-recorded. So anything, if you have any confusion in anything, just call me out and I will share it with you on the WhatsApp group on the YouTube link. Look at this. If the issuance of share is less than 20 to 25%, in that case, we take the market price. But if it is more than 20 to 25%, like in our example, it was 40%. So we simply took the par. But if it is less than 20 to 25%, which is 10% in this case, in that case, you take the market price. So if it is above 20 to 25%, like in our example, 40%, you simply take the par, no market value. no extra additional premium, or what you call the extra or additional paid in capital. Right? I hope you got the idea. Okay, now moving on to your technology and analytics. So let me just pause it here.